to operate in the polar environment, it is necessary to understand that there are crucial differences between the northern and southern hemispheres, and these differences will significantly impact on how you can operate and what you can and cannot do, particularly in a survival situation. Understanding these differences, even if you operate in only one region, will give you a greater chance of operating successfully and, most importantly, provide you with the greatest chance of survival should you be thrust into the environment by calamity. Let's look at the two separate polar environments. The first thing to recognise is that the Arctic and the Antarctic are different in almost every respect, even in terms of their maritime nature. The Arctic is an ocean basin. In the Arctic, floating sea ice develops between the land masses and covers the surface of the sea to varying thicknesses. This means that the North Pole is a theoretical point on the ocean's surface and on the seabed below. In contrast, however, the Antarctic is a landmass covered by ice. The landmass of Antarctica is mountainous, and the polar plateau where the South Pole is situated is over 9,000 feet above sea level. This makes the South Pole colder than the North Pole, and cold air from the polar plateau flows down to the coastline of Antarctica. In the Antarctic winter, the sea ice grows out from the landmass and Antarctica effectively doubles in size. Antarctica is the coldest, driest and windiest place on Earth. Winter temperatures in Antarctica can fall to minus 70 degrees Celsius and below, but summer coastal temperatures may actually be anywhere between minus 25 degrees Celsius and plus 5 degrees Celsius. This means that almost all activity in Antarctica outside of the international scientific community's work happens in the austral summer. Certainly, the passenger ships that visit the Antarctic Peninsula only do so in the marginal months of the austral summer, when the sea ice is generally far less evident. In the Arctic, the surface sea temperature doesn't generally fall below minus 1.8 in the winter. In Antarctica, the sea temperature is generally between minus 1.8 and minus 3.2. A big difference between the Arctic and the Antarctic maritime environments is associated with the types of ice in the water. This is particularly true around the Antarctic Peninsula, where many of the shipping operations occur. In the Arctic, ice that isn't sea ice comes mainly from the glaciers of places like Greenland. However, in Antarctica, much of the ice comes from the edges of the huge ice shelves that cover the continent. This makes southern icebergs very much larger and tabular compared to the northern ones. The Antarctic icebergs tend to be maintained in a constant track around Antarctica because of the circumpolar current, which goes around the coastline of the continent. This means they are locked into the colder waters, and so they do not degenerate so quickly. One region that is markedly different to this is the Antarctic Peninsula, where much of the commercial shipping visits. Here there are glaciers that feed directly into the sea, and this process has been increasing as ice shelves that once held back the glaciers have broken away due to the intense warming of the region. The ice from the base of the glaciers is seen as blue ice when it is in the water, and icebergs of blue ice are known commonly as growlers. These represent a significant threat to shipping because the ice is formed under immense pressure, and it is therefore much harder than normal sea ice. Because the Antarctic commercial shipping operations normally only happen in the summer and are generally confined to the western coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, it is unlikely that you would find yourself having to live on sea ice in the event of a calamity. Instead, it is much more likely that if you weren't in a life raft, then you would be on the shore. This might seem a preferable option. However, it does present its own problems, as many a sailor set down on the land of Antarctica during the austral summer has been unable to be picked up by the ships due to the rapid formation of sea ice as the temperatures plummet at the end of the summer season. This was true of both Scott and Shackleton's men. In the Arctic, conditions are very, very different. Historically, the maritime waters were denied to shipping due to the continuous sea ice. But with changes in global temperatures that have warmed the planet, the sea ice is thinning and can now be broken through by icebreakers. This has opened the Arctic waters to commercial shipping operations, and these operations now occur throughout the year, including through the extreme winter months. This itself presents its own difficulties for those operating in these waters. While the sea ice has thinned, allowing ships to break through on the northeast and the northwest passage, it was the sea ice that allowed those walking to the North Pole to get there. This means that the sea ice conditions are actually less predictable, and there isn't necessarily the guarantee that those who might have to abandon a ship could do so onto firm sea ice, not just in the summer months of the year, but also now in the margins of the winter months. This presents a significant risk to those ships operating throughout the year in these polar waters. It's important to get some understanding of what these two differing situations mean for the polar mariner. In the Arctic, there are very variable conditions throughout the year. There are periods of total darkness, particularly as you go into the higher latitudes and during the winter months. Conversely, there are periods when the sun doesn't set. In the beginning of the year, the sun doesn't rise above the horizon until the end of February. This is the coldest time of year, but it is also when the sea ice is at its most stable. This is the time when most polar explorers would be heading to the North Pole. They will do this because the conditions on the sea ice are at their best for both skiing and camping. Living conditions at this time, though, can be very challenging. The extreme cold makes survival difficult, and proper clothing and equipment is essential to maintain life. Temperatures can reach -40 degrees Celsius and below. For polar travellers, the temperature inside their tent can be the same as outside the tent. This photograph, taken inside a tent, shows that the temperature is -40 degrees Celsius. That is twice as cold as the average home freezer. This means that the dangers of suffering a cold injury are just as real inside the tent as outside a tent. The main thing that allows polar travellers to survive in these conditions is having appropriate clothing, sleeping bags, and a source of heat to melt water and cook food. A stove operating inside a tent can quickly raise the temperature inside the tent to +20 degrees, making life that much more bearable. But once the stove is turned out, then temperatures will quickly fall to the ambient level outside the tent, and so sleeping bags and polar clothing are absolutely essential for the maintenance of life. The Arctic Ocean is only flat when there is no sea ice on it. Whenever sea ice forms, it creates a physical landscape that is undulating and can in instances be incredibly undulating. As the sea ice forms, it is moved by the force of currents and the wind, resulting in collisions and fractures between the different pieces of ice and the different ice plates. The collisions and fractures produce ridges and depressions, creating a labyrinth of ice rubble that those trying to live on the ice need to negotiate if they intend to move over the ice, or which they will need to deal with if they are setting up a camp. When the sea ice collides together, it can form huge pressure ridges, which make movement difficult. Now, these pressure ridges can be both a benefit and a challenge to establishing a camp on the ice. A pressure ridge may provide a bit of protection from the wind, or the ridge might appear and threaten a campsite, as they can form very, very quickly and they can move very, very rapidly. The sea ice can also fracture and drift apart, creating an open water channel or lead. Again, these can open very quickly, and if your camp is set over the fracture zone, you would need to act quickly to avoid disaster. If you were to try to travel over the ice, you might need to cross these open water channels or go around them. Now, certain features can help you identify what to do in such a situation. Where an open water channel forms, the water is generally -1.8 degrees Celsius, which is a lot warmer than the air temperature. This can cause a fog or a cloud to form over the water, and it will commonly have a cigar-type shape because it follows the fracture line. This can tell you where you should avoid heading. In this photograph, you can see that there is a lot of ice jumbled up and presenting as a pressure ridge off to the left. This might suggest that the ice is pivoting at a point off to the left on the photograph. And with the fracture opening up in front of the person, but the ice forming together as a pressure ridge off to the left, then that might indicate it would be valuable to move to the left and seek a crossing in that direction. Another way of crossing the water, though, is to swim. Now, unappealing as it might seem, with the temperature of the water being only 1.8 degrees, it might be absolutely necessary. But the big issue when the air temperature is minus 30 degrees Celsius is not the getting into the water, it is the getting out. Unless you are protected, getting out of the sea into minus 30 degrees air temperature will rapidly lead to the seawater freezing on you and the significant loss of body temperature, first at the extremities and then in the core. Frostbite and hypothermia would be the outcomes in such instance. Polar travellers generally use immersion suits or dry suits to make the crossing of an open water channel, but it is still a difficult and demanding business. Sometimes, when the channels begin to open, there will be blocks of ice left in the channel, and these can be used to cross the gap. However, they can be unstable and can turn over, which might lead to a person falling in. Polar travellers have to learn to trust themselves and identify which blocks are stable enough to use for a crossing. The dangers of falling through the ice or into an open water channel are very real, and they are very significant. As shown in this photograph, the chances of being able to reach up and pull yourself out can be very low. The ice is slippy and doesn't necessarily provide much purchase. It may also be a large distance from the surface of the water to the top of the ice. Ice sheets can be meters thick, and this means that they are high above the water, so preventing anyone from reaching up and being able to grab and gain purchase on the ice sheet itself. The ice can also be a complete jumble of blocks with open water between all of them, meaning that anyone moving or trying to live on the ice would need to move from block to block and have to try to avoid from getting on top of a block that was unstable, one that might turn over because of their additional body weight. It is important to remember that the sea ice does, though, vary over the year and can take on some unusual aspects. These are important in a survival situation and should influence any decision-making process about what needs to be done. The sea ice freezes initially in distinct blobs known as pancake ice. These then start to clump together and coalesce into what is better known as an ice sheet. As the process happens, the gathering clumps of ice might be strong enough to bear weight. Even if the ice appears weak and unlikely to be able to bear weight, it might just do so. The ice can also appear to be waxy and almost like a plastic film over the surface of the sea. It might even undulate with the sea's movements, but it might still be able to hold a person if they have skis on, or snowshoes, or some other thing which they can use to spread their weight. Now, this process happens across the entire sea surface, but initiates at the point where the temperatures are lowest. Ice that forms and doesn't melt is known as multi-year ice, and because it doesn't melt and then reform, the salts are pushed out and it becomes clearer and more blue. Ice that doesn't go through this process is known as first-year ice, and it is less dense, weaker, and generally more easily broken. Let's now take just a few moments to consider some of the hazards, risks, and threats of the polar environments. There are numerous hazards associated with operating in the polar regions. The most obvious one, and clearly the one with the most potential to inflict harm, is the cold. At temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius, special care needs to be taken to make sure that the skin is not exposed, as any exposure would rapidly lead to frostnip, then frostbite. Even a temperature of minus 10 degrees can become hugely serious if there is a wind blowing due to a thing called the wind chill. A temperature of 0 degrees will feel like minus 22 if there is a wind of just 10 miles an hour. A temperature of -10 will feel like -52 degrees Celsius if there is a wind of just 20 miles an hour. This means it is important to remember to wear protective equipment when there is any kind of wind, even when the air temperature feels relatively warm. One other factor that is important is that you do not sweat in these cold temperatures. Now this might seem counterintuitive, as surely if you work hard to create body heat, you will stay warm. While creating heat to stay warm is fine, but creating too much heat so that you sweat to get rid of that heat isn't. All moisture in the polar environment freezes, particularly when it is very cold. If you sweat into your clothing, then the moisture will freeze. This now means that you have to work even harder to generate heat to stop the moisture from freezing, and there is a limited amount of time that a person can do this for. Once the heat generation stops, then the body will be further cooled by the ice in the clothing and boots, leading to hypothermia and frostbite. The way that this can be prevented is to wear the right clothing and the right amount of clothing for the activity level you're undertaking. Take layers off before you get so hot that you start to sweat, and put them back on again before you begin to get too cold. If you do sweat into your clothing, then every effort should be made to try to dry the clothing out and remove any ice before the clothing is used further. Another hazard in the Arctic is the constant movement of the ice. If you're trying to live on the ice or travel across the ice, this presents a significant hazard, particularly when things such as clear water channels are opening up or pressure ridges are forming. These are dynamic, unpredictable and potentially life-threatening disturbances. If you are setting up a tent or camp, then care needs to be taken to consider what are the risks posed by the sheet breaking up or a pressure ridge forming near your location. In considering camping in either polar environment, then the very fact of operating from a tent introduces the potential risk of a tent fire, particularly if people are trying to cook or heat the tent. This risk is obviously increased if people are not trained to use the cooker or have little experience of operating in a tent. Another risk is falling through the ice or slipping and falling on the ice. The ice can be extremely slippy, particularly if it is blue ice, and the risk is increased if you are going to have to manoeuvre over the ice and it was full of pressure ridges. For those that find themselves suddenly thrust into the polar environment, a very real risk is one of being overwhelmed, both mentally and emotionally, by the nature of the environment. This will lead to the loss of mental capacity to think and consider motivations for self-preservation. This is particularly true if it is a calamity that has thrust them onto the environment, and if they are without the right clothing and equipment. There are some wildlife threats in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, though the threat in the Arctic is far more tangible and real. While leopard seals in the Antarctic can present a risk, particularly if you are in the water, the chances of them impacting on survival are very small. However, in the Arctic, the polar bear presents a very serious and deadly risk. Polar bears have attacked people, and they are the absolute top of the food chain in this environment. They are more than capable of stalking and attacking humans, and their sheer size and power makes them difficult to deter. Every effort should be made to avoid polar bears, but they are nomadic hunters who can run and swim faster than any human being. At any point in the Arctic, the dangers of polar bears should be considered in every decision-making activity. While we have now considered some of the threats, risks and hazards of the polar regions, it should be remembered that the polar regions are incredibly beautiful and incredibly untouched. They are hugely difficult places and environments for humans to operate in. That said, people have now been operating in the polar regions for well over 100 years. Much has been learned about the environment, and all of this information is available to you to further your knowledge and your understanding of what it takes to operate in the polar regions.